astronauts of Apollo 14. The Voice of America brings you a conversation with the men flying the current space mission to the moon. Command Pilot Alan Shepard, Command Module Pilot Stuart Roosa, and Lunar Module Pilot Edgar Mitchell. This program was recorded in Houston several days ago. To introduce the astronauts of Apollo 14, here is correspondent Rhett Turner.
Al Shepard, Captain, United States Navy, the first American to go into space, and now you're on the way to the moon. Just for our listeners, Al, tell us just a bit about your background. What part of the United States do you come from originally?
Well, I come from New England, state of New Hampshire, actually. I was born there, went through high school in New Hampshire, then went away to the Naval Academy for my undergraduate training. Joined the Navy, started flying, and I've been flying ever since.
And you were one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts. Do you remember anything interesting about how you were selected? Did you know the other 6 at that time?
I knew 2 of the other 6 at the time of our selection, but I don't know. It was a fairly involved process. They looked inside our brains, they examined our bodies and looked at our background and kind of put everything all together.
Do you think it's changed now in the current selection process?
It's pretty much the same. There's been, as perhaps you know, there's been emphasis in the early days on piloting ability, and in the later days on scientific background as a experience prior to being selected. I think this certainly reflects the advance in technology associated with spaceflight over the past 12 years since the original selection. But the selection processes are pretty much the same. I think it's a valid one. You take a look at what a guy's specialty is, first of all. You take a look at how well he has performed, and if he's performed well in his own specialty, it's a pretty safe assumption he's going to perform well as an astronaut. Mm-hmm. And you take a look to see how healthy he is. It's pretty much the way we do it.
Has this 10 years passed quite fast for you since your first flight?
Oh, tremendously, yeah. Been an extremely busy time, of course, for all of us, but the time certainly hasn't dragged. It seems like only yesterday.
Before you became commander of this crew and began specific preparations, you were the chief of the astronauts over there in the headquarters near here. Mm-hmm. Just summarize your activities there in running that area for several years throughout the rest of the Gemini and Apollo programs.
You know, actually, there were 2 of us involved, Deke Slayton and myself. Deke was also in the original group. And during the time period to which you refer, Deke was kind of responsible for the equipment and the airplanes that we fly, the training equipment and so on, and I was kind of responsible for the administrative functions and problems of the astronauts themselves, and the 2 of us kind of worked together to handle those activities in those days. It was primarily an administrative office type function, although I did stay active in flying airplanes. Mm-hmm. And in keeping up on the general development of spacecraft hardware.
And you and Slayton were both part of the group which selected new astronauts which came into the program, weren't you?
That's correct.
Mm-hmm. It must be exciting to be ready to go again.
Well, I think it's exciting, yeah.
Is it?
It's a little too early to really start the adrenaline flowing, because if I did, I wouldn't make it to the end of the month. I don't have that much adrenaline.
Okay, good luck.
But we're happy about it. We're looking forward to it.
Stuart Allen Roosa, Major, United States Air Force, astronaut, Command Module Pilot, Apollo 14. Stu, this is your first time into space, right?
That's correct.
Tell us just a bit about where you come from and your educational background. What part of the United States were you born in?
Well, I was born in Durango, Colorado, and I actually left Durango at a fairly early age. My father was employed with the Bureau of Reclamation, and at this time we moved, I'd say generally throughout the western part of the United States for several years, and then settled down in Oklahoma, where I essentially grew up. I finished grade school, all of my high school, and 1 year of college in Oklahoma. And then at this time I went to the University of Arizona for a second year of college, and then entered aviation cadets. And my field of study was engineering. However, my first love was flying. I always has been. As a boy, I always was fascinated with airplanes and models. I had models all over my room, and during World War II, of course, I went to every aviation movie I could find and built all of our models.
You would have just been a teenager then during World War II, right?
That's right. Let me see, 33.
Still, you wouldn't have learned to fly by that time, I don't think.
No, I did not have a chance to fly. I was dreaming of flying at that point and flying my models.
This is a typical story among American boys, isn't it? Is this love of aviation beginning in the model building stages when you're 8, 10, 12 years old?
Well, I can't speak for everybody else, but it certainly was for me.
When'd you learn to fly?
Okay, and then during high school, I was in the Civil Air Patrol, and at that time, they did not give instruction in the Civil Air Patrol. I'm not sure what the regulations are now, but I got a little flying time in light aircraft, and you needed 2 years of college to get into aviation cadets. So as soon as I completed my 2 years of college, and in between a few working for the Forest Service in the Northwest for a couple of seasons. I was a smoke jumper one season out of Cave Junction, Oregon for the Forest Service.
You got a nickname of Smokey then, didn't you?
That came up on Apollo 9 when I was Capcommon, and I was nicknamed Smokey there because of my previous connection with the Forest Service.
How many jumps did you make?
I made 12. And I finished up that season and had my 60 hours and actually applied for aviation cadets from the Northwest. I left Oregon and went down to the friendly recruiter in 01 to join the cadets. So went to Oakland and went through all the tests and passed them and got a class assignment in December of '53. Mm-hmm. And it started me on the road to my wings.
And your flying career, which led into your being accepted in the astronaut program?
Well, I finished up my cadet program, and then I was assigned to what your first choice, as far as I'm concerned, was a fighter squadron out of gunnery school to Langley, Virginia, and flew 84Fs and F-100s, and made a flight to Europe in F-100, and I've had two things that I wanted to do. One was to finish up my degree, and the other one was to go to the test pilot school at Edwards. And I did get both of those in, actually in that order. The Air Force has a program under which you apply, and if accepted, you can go back to school on active duty and get your degree. It's called the Air Force Institute of Technology program. I applied for this and was accepted. Went back to Colorado and got my degree in aeronautical engineering.
Mm-hmm. When?
From 58 to 60.
I would assume that as an active jet pilot, you became interested in the manned space program the minute you heard about it, huh?
Absolutely. I've wanted in the program ever since they announced Project Mercury.
Then how did you apply and how were you accepted?
Okay, well, see, the route at that time to be accepted was to be a graduate of a test pilot school, either the Air Force School at Edwards or the Navy School at Patuxent. And everyone that had been selected up to that time had been a graduate of the school. So my next goal was to go to one of those schools. And my assignment out of Colorado was to Japan, so I came back 2 years later and applied for a test pilot school, was accepted at Edwards. That was in '64. And I finished the school, stayed at Edwards working in fighter test ops. And fortunately, NASA had a selection, and so I applied for that in the fall of '65, and spring of '66 found me down here.
Mm-hmm. Ed, this is your first flight into space and our first acquaintance with you as an astronaut. Edgar Mitchell, Commander, United States Navy, lunar module pilot for Apollo 14. Tell us just a bit about yourself. Where do you come from in the United States originally?
Well, Red, I was born here in Texas, in the Panhandle, as a matter of fact. Grew up in Texas and New Mexico, and since I finished my early schooling, have lived all over this country, mostly in the naval service. I call Artesia, New Mexico my home. However, I haven't lived there in over 20 years.
And where'd you go to college? How'd you get your...
Well, I took my first bachelor's degree at Carnegie Institute of Technology, which is now Carnegie Mellon University. I took a second bachelor's degree in aeronautics at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, and a doctorate in astronautics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology.
You are a doctor of science, right?
A doctor of science, that's correct.
Now, that's in, you say aeronautics and astronautics. What does that make you an expert in?
Well,
in one brief word.
I'm not sure it makes me an expert in anything. I think it may qualify me to try to become an expert in something.
Tell me about your service career. When did you go into the Navy?
I entered the Navy in 1952. As a matter of fact, I enlisted in the Navy.
Had you learned to fly before that?
Yes. I started flying in 1945.
And you were a kid at home then, weren't you?
Yes, that's right. I started flying before I could legally have a learner's permit, although I flew with my uncle, and subsequently obtained a student pilot's license and the private license and a commercial license eventually. But I've been flying since 1945, enlisted in the Navy in 1952, and entered the Naval Air Service in 1953, started through training there.
Were you flying jets before you entered the astronaut program?
Yes, I was.
Where?
Well, the last active duty Navy squadron I was in was a heavy attack squadron in the Pacific. We were flying from carriers at that point. From that, I went to test and development work at China Lake, California, before I started into my postgraduate education. And from the postgraduate education at MIT, I went to a management position with the Navy in the ill-fated MOL program, and from that went to Edwards for a year with the Air Force, and then here to the astronaut program.
Al Shepard, you look to be in mighty good shape for this flight. It was almost 10 years ago that you began the American manned space program with your first suborbital flight in Mercury. How do you keep in shape? What do you do?
Well, I primarily jog, although it's rather distasteful to me. I find that jogging a couple of miles every day that I can is perhaps the best, quickest way to keep me in reasonably good condition. I lift a few weights, not anything real heavy, but
you still do a lot
light weights.
There's been a lot of good-natured teasing, which you've responded to, about the fact that now at the age of 47, you will be the oldest astronaut to go into space, a bit older than some of the Russian cosmonauts who were in their mid-40s. You're now 47 years old, and you look good. The doctors say you're good. And tell me about the kidding. Anybody give you a hard time?
Well, I don't really mind about the kidding. I think probably before too long, perhaps another 3 or 4 years, there'll be somebody who goes into space that'll be older than I currently am. As a matter of fact, I wouldn't mind being the first astronaut over 50 in space.
It's a matter of how you are in your head and how you keep your body, huh?
Yeah, I guess that's it.
Okay. Do the simulations, do the countless rehearsals that you conduct really put you in a point of complete relaxation and calm, other than just the knowledge that here we go?
I don't think anybody that's flown has been completely relaxed and calm since the year one. And I don't know any other way to reduce that to a minimum than the way you've just suggested. As a matter of fact, I think that using these simulators and the realism that's provided in the use of them is such that you sort of get nervous when you think about crashing even with a simulator, that it is that effective a tool. And they really give an individual the feeling that says, well, you've been there before, kind of a thing. You have the feeling that you've been landing on the moon before, you've been taking off from the Cape before. That, of course, is not completely true, but it gives you the feeling that this is the case, and that helps to reduce the concern that everybody has.
Mm-hmm. I can hear your voice right now during that first part of the liftoff from your first flight. I've heard it so many times. We'll be hearing it again.
You're listening to a special conversation with the astronauts of Apollo 14, Alan Shepard, Stuart Roosa, and Edgar Mitchell. Again, VOA correspondent Rhett Turner in Houston.
Stu, would you run through briefly for our listeners the command module changes? As command module pilot, this is something you're well aware of here. After the Apollo 13 accident, tell us about what has been added and the safety measures enacted.
All right, I think I'll start with briefly saying why 13 had the problem, and the loss of an oxygen tank and loss of all power may not be understood, but so I'll just very briefly, we get our power in the command module, or command service module, from fuel cells. And these fuel cells are the reverse of the electrolysis of water that everybody did in their high school physics. And there you passed an electric current through the water and got hydrogen and oxygen out. In our fuel cells, we do the reverse. We take hydrogen and oxygen, combine them in the fuel cell, and get water in which we actually drink, and get our electrical power, which we use to power the spacecraft. And also, the oxygen not only goes to the fuel cells, but it goes to our environmental system. In other words, the oxygen that we breathe. So, on 13, when they lost all the oxygen, they not only lost all the power, but also any oxygen to breathe, so they had to use the LEM system. All right, we have now changed. At that time, they were carrying 2 oxygen tanks that were manifolded together to
the same supply line.
Same supply line. So now on Apollo 14, we have added a 3rd oxygen tank. It is physically located on the opposite side of the spacecraft, opposite side of the service module. So we have a distance separation. We have also put the necessary valves in the line so we can isolate the tank in the plumbing from the other 2 tanks. So now if we lose the 3rd oxygen tank, we can isolate the other 2. If we lose the other 2, we can isolate the 3rd one. Mm-hmm. And we will always have oxygen to breathe. Okay, so that solved one problem. The next problem we had to solve was the problem of power. All right, if you lose the other 2, you may or may not have enough in the 3rd oxygen tank to supply your environmental oxygen plus your power. So we have added a battery. We call it an aux battery, or you may hear this term.
Auxiliary battery.
Auxiliary battery. This will give us enough power to come back from any point in the mission with the loss of all of the fuel cells. Now we have 3 additional batteries on board the command module. They're quite small. They're a 40 amp hour battery. And these 3 batteries must be saved for entry. So our whole mode of operation is we must keep those 3 batteries to use for re-entry, or you've lost the whole ball game.
In addition to this, the engineers analyzed the failure and corrected the cause of the explosion on 13. That couldn't happen again, as I understand.
No.
Correspondent Turner asked astronaut Ed Mitchell to explain more about plans to explore the moon.
Ed Mitchell is lunar module pilot. You and Al Shepard are going to be very, very busy for between 4 and 5 hours there on the first EVA. Now, after you depress the cabin, after Al climbs out, first of all, you will be helping check Al out and get him out the door, won't you?
That is correct. My first task after depressurization of the cabin is to assist Al in getting out the door. I go out very shortly after that, as soon as he's down on the surface. I go out, and the 2 of us then do what we call housekeeping and getting the exterior of the lunar module ready for the EVA. We offload equipment, set up our television camera, get some of the consumables that need to be transferred from the descent stage to the ascent stage ready to go up. I take a contingency sample in case anything should happen. The geologists have a sample from the lunar surface. We then set up the solar wind experiment. We set up the flag. We set up the S-band antenna. And about that point, I come back into the lunar module and transfer our communications from the S-band antenna that's on the spacecraft to the one that we have just erected on the surface.
You're going to turn on the high-powered portable S-band antenna.
That is correct.
You're going to climb back in. Is that about a half hour into the timeline?
I believe that's about right.
And then you and Al will get to work with that experiments package, won't you?
We then get the ALSEP package out of the LIM.
The experiments package.
The experiments package. Get it set up to traverse out to the ALSEP deployment site.
About how far away from the LIM now will you move to put the central station?
Well, we would like to go a minimum of 350 feet and probably will not go more than 500 to 600 feet.
Oh, between 100 and 200 meters.
Right.
For those of our listeners who use the metric system there. Okay, and you both will go out with that and then deploy it, right?
That
Put
is
out
correct.
all the gadgets.
That's right.
Tell me about all the gadgets and the experiments in the experiments package.
Well, of the experiments we carry out, it is not in the package. The first one that comes to mind is the laser ranging and reflecting. That has to be carried out in addition to the ALSEP package. We pull the MET out with some of our hand tools on it. On the ALSEP itself, we have the active seismic experiment, which consists of the mortar pack and the thumper geophone line.
You're going to put some explosive charges on the surface to try to rattle the surface to make seismic measurements.
That's correct. The mortar pack will not be used until long after we've left the surface. However, we will use the same seismometers, the same line of geophones, with the little thumper device, which has 21 shotgun shell sized charges in it. Which will be used by myself on the lunar surface at that time.
Oh, you're the one who's going to walk out some 200 feet or so, approaching 100 meters,
right.
approaching 100 meters, and then walk back and fire off the thumper about every 5 or 6 meters.
That's correct.
I wonder if we'll be able to hear that on the air-to-ground conversation. Can you hear it inside your spacesuit? You can in 1G.
Well, we don't, I have never fired them inside the spacesuit. We do not fire them in practice, and those that I have fired, I have not had a suit on. Now, it is quite possible that the noise or the vibrations from the thumper can travel up my arm and through the suit and through the air inside the suit and key the Vox circuit in the mic. I don't know whether that will happen.
That's something we'll just have to find out.
We'll just have to wait and find out. It's an interesting possibility, however, but I rather doubt it.
You're not going to be, your ears aren't going to be ringing from the thumping sound.
No, I'm sure that will not happen.
Okay, and the rest of the ALSEP?
We have a passive seismic experiment now, which is similar to the ones that have been carried in the past.
Apollo 11 and 12 each had them, didn't they?
Right. We have what we call the SIDE. And
Suprathermal ion detector.
Right.
Yeah.
And in conjunction with that is the so-called CCIG.
Cold cathode ion gauge.
That is correct.
If I have my acronyms right.
Acronyms are very difficult to remember, even for me. Well, of course, the central station itself is somewhat of a phenomenon, although we have used them before. It is a nuclear power plant, which I think your listeners might be interested in. It is a nuclear power plant which puts out very few watts, as a matter of fact, but sufficient to drive all these experiments and run a telemetry station to get the telemetry back to the Earth.
For a year or so?
For a year or so.
Have you a new method of removing that power unit so that it won't stick? As I recall, Conrad and Bean had to hit it with a hammer to get it out.
Well, I think we've solved that problem. We had some thermal expansion problems in the unit they carried, and our engineers tell us that they have solved that, so we shouldn't have any problem with it. I'd like to think we won't. We have the Charged Particle Lunar Environment Experiment, a so-called CPLE, again, one of the long, difficult acronyms, which is deployed.
Now, you will do some other things during that first EVA, won't you, besides deploy the ALSEP package? Would you describe them?
We do a geological exploration. We pick up samples of the lunar surface. We do a soil mechanics. We do engineering evaluation of the MET. all in the same time frame. And we take documentary pictures, engineering pictures, all somewhat simultaneously.
If this first EVA, extravehicular activity period, is extended, if everything is going well, if your consumables, your use of the PLIS, the Portable Life Support System, is going properly, I think I'm naming some of the parameters that would be contributing to your decision on this. How long could you stay outside during that first period?
We're looking at a total time of 5 hours.
And go through some of the considerations there, then review it for me.
The real considerations outside of crew fatigue, which we don't think is going to enter into it, the real considerations are the water, the oxygen, and the battery supplies in the PLIS. Our people on the ground will be monitoring that. They will be monitoring how hard we work. And of course, the amount of oxygen and water that is consumed is directly proportional to how hard we work. We have to keep our bodies cool down, reject the metabolic heat that is built up. If we can work at a good steady pace, there will be no problem in going 5 hours. And this is what we really propose to do.
What part of your overall activity would you extend then? Sampling of rocks?
Probably
and dust?
sampling, but our scientists in the Mission Control Center are preparing and have prepared real-time tasks, and it will probably involve moving some of the highly desirable items from EVA 2 into EVA 1.
Get ahead of the game.
Get ahead of the game so that we can spend more time in EVA 2 on lunar sampling. This is the current plan. Of course, we like to remain flexible so that if we see strange or unusual features on the lunar surface, we have time to sample, document, describe, talk it over with the ground, and do what we hope is a thoroughly scientific job of sampling and documenting these phenomena.
While Mitchell and Shepard are exploring the moon, astronaut Rusa, orbiting overhead in the command module Kitty Hawk, will be taking detailed pictures of a future landing site, the mountainous region known as Descartes. Rusa will also conduct scientific experiments designed to learn more about interstellar lights and other phenomena. Correspondent Turner concluded the interview with astronaut Alan Shepard.
In the second EVA, what do you think is the most important part of your scheduled activity? What do you expect to be the most interesting?
Well, I guess things that we can see and touch and pick up will be the most interesting to us. If you're talking about on-the-spot interest, you
should be able to see
most
a good
of the
distance.
experiments, the collection of the rocks, and most of the things that we do during the second EVA, of course, are very carefully analyzed, and the results and determined days, weeks, months, and even years later. From our point of view, I think the most interesting thing will certainly be to get up on the top of Cone Crater to look at it. It's got to be an impressive thing. It's 900, 1,000 feet across and 300 feet deep. You know, it's more than just a little hole out in your backyard. So it's got to be impressive. I think that'll certainly capture our interest. The size of the boulders around the rim of Cone Crater have got to be kind of wild. So there'll be a lot of interesting things right up there in the vicinity of the rim of that crater.
Good luck, Al, throughout the mission.
Thank you.
You've heard the astronauts of Apollo 14, Commander Alan Shepard, Command Module Pilot Stuart Rusa, and Lunar Module Pilot Edgar Mitchell, describing objectives of the current American space mission to the moon. VOA correspondent Rhett Turner recorded this conversation several days ago at the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston. This is Jack Moyle speaking.